Imagine a hospital wing that vanished overnight. No records, no survivors, just a locked door and the echo of screams that haunted the halls for decades. What if I told you that in 1910, a group of patients disappeared without a trace, and the only thing left behind was a chilling rumor? The ward that screamed? Tonight we're going to uncover the secrets of the doctor's secret ward, a place so mysterious that even the bravest nurses refuse to speak its name. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll question everything you thought you knew about hospitals, history, and the secrets that hide in plain sight. It was the kind of night that seemed to swallow sound. The wind howled through the narrow streets of the city, rattling the windows of St. Augustine's Hospital. Rain lashed against the stone walls, and the gas lamps flickered, casting long, trembling shadows across the polished floors. Inside, the hospital was a world unto itself, a place of hope and healing, but also of secrets and sorrow. St. Augustine's was known for its size and its reputation. It was the largest hospital in the region, a sprawling complex of brick and marble, with wings that stretched out like the arms of a guardian. People came from miles around to seek treatment here, trusting the doctors and nurses with their lives. But on this night, something was different. There was a tension in the air, a sense that something was about to happen. The East Wing, known as Ward C, was usually alive with activity. Nurses hurried from room to room, checking on patients, adjusting bandages, and offering words of comfort. The patients themselves were a mix of the hopeful and the hopeless, some recovering from surgery, others battling illnesses that had no name. But tonight the corridor was silent. The only sound was the distant rumble of thunder and the soft, steady drip of rainwater from a leaky ceiling. Nurse Margaret was the first to notice. She was making her rounds, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, when she realized that every door in Ward C was closed. That was unusual. The doors were always left slightly ajar so the nurses could hear if a patient called out. But tonight they were shut tight, as if someone or something wanted to keep the world out. Margaret hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle of room 12. She knocked softly. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. She pressed her ear to the door and listened. For a moment she thought she heard a faint whisper, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She moved on to the next room and the next, but it was the same everywhere. Silence. She felt a chill run down her spine. Something was wrong. At the end of the corridor, the door to the doctor's office was slightly open. Light spilled out into the hallway, casting a golden glow on the yellowish floor. Margaret approached, her heart pounding in her chest. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office was empty. The desk was covered in papers, medical charts, and a single, half-empty cup of tea. The doctor's coat hung on the back of the chair, as if he had just stepped out for a moment, but there was no sign of him. Margaret turned to leave, but something caught her eye, a small, leather-bound notebook lying open on the desk. She picked it up and scanned the pages. The handwriting was neat, precise, almost mechanical. The entries were short, clinical, devoid of emotion. But the last entry was different. It read, "Tonight is the night. The experiment begins. No one must interfere." Margaret felt a wave of fear wash over her. She put the notebook down and hurried back into the hallway. She needed to find the head nurse, to tell her what she had seen. But as she turned the corner, she stopped dead in her tracks. The doors to Ward C were closing, one by one, as if pushed by invisible hands. She watched in horror as the heavy wooden doors swung shut, the locks clicking into place. She ran to the nearest door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. She pounded on the wood, shouting for help, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. Inside the ward, the patients were trapped. Some banged on the doors, their fists leaving bloody smears on the glass. Others huddled in their beds, eyes wide with terror. The nurses inside tried to calm them, but their own fear was palpable. No one knew what was happening. No one knew why the doors were locked. Outside, the rest of the hospital was in chaos. Doctors and nurses rushed to the East Wing, but the doors were sealed tight. The hospital director arrived, his face pale and drawn. He ordered the maintenance staff to break down the doors, but the locks held firm. It was as if the ward itself had decided to shut out the world. As the night wore on, the screams from inside grew louder. Some were cries for help. Others were wordless wails of terror. The sound echoed through the halls, reaching every corner of the hospital. Patients in other wards covered their ears, weeping in fear. Nurses whispered prayers under their breath, their hands shaking as they clung to each other. And then, just before dawn, the screaming stopped. The silence was absolute. It was as if the hospital itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the spell. The staff stood in the hallway staring at the locked doors, afraid to move, afraid to speak. When the sun finally rose, the hospital director made a decision. He ordered the East Wing sealed. No one was to enter. No one was to speak of what had happened. The patients' families were told that there had been an accident, that the ward was being renovated. The truth was buried, hidden behind a wall of silence and fear. But the memory of that night lingered. The staff who had been there never forgot the sound of the doors closing, the screams that echoed through the halls, the sense of helplessness that gripped them all. Some left the hospital, unable to face the memories. Others stayed, but they were never the same. For years, the sealed ward became a legend. Children dared each other to touch the locked door. Nurses avoided the east corridor after dark, and the hospital's records for that night? Gone, erased, as if the patients had never existed. But the truth could not be hidden forever. The story of the doctor's secret ward would haunt St. Augustine's for generations, a reminder that some doors should never be closed and some secrets should never be kept. But what if the real terror wasn't the night the doors closed, but the man who held the key? In the next chapter, you'll meet the doctor whose very presence sent chills through the hospital and discover why his name was erased from every record. If you think you've heard hospital horror stories before, wait until you see what's coming. Don't miss the next chapter. And if you're drawn to mysteries like this, make sure you subscribe to Sanctified Secrets so you never miss a revelation. The morning after the doors of Ward C were sealed, a heavy silence hung over St. Augustine's Hospital. The staff moved through the halls as if in a trance, their faces pale, their eyes haunted. The events of the previous night had left a mark on everyone, but for some, the fear was deeper, more personal. They knew that the heart of the mystery was not just the locked doors or the vanished patients. It was the man who had come to be known only as the Doctor with No Name. He had arrived at St. Augustine's in the late summer of 1910, just weeks before the incident. No one knew where he came from. His references were impeccable, his credentials impressive, but there was something about him that set people on edge. He was tall and thin, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. His hair was dark, almost black, and always perfectly combed. He wore his white coat like a uniform, never a wrinkle or a stain, and he moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that made people step aside without realizing it. The first time Nurse Margaret saw him, she felt a chill run down her spine. He was standing at the end of the corridor, watching her as she made her rounds. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just stared with those cold, unblinking eyes. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was just nerves, but the memory lingered. The other nurses whispered about him in the break room. Some said he was a genius, a man who had studied in the finest hospitals in Europe. Others claimed he had been dismissed from his last post under mysterious circumstances. No one knew for sure. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was low and even, with no trace of an accent. He never laughed and never joked, never showed any emotion at all. But there was no denying his skill. Patients under his care often improved rapidly, sometimes in ways that seemed almost miraculous. A woman with a fever that wouldn't break suddenly sat up in bed, her cheeks flushed with color. A man who had been paralyzed by a stroke began to move his fingers, then his hands, then his arms. The staff marveled at these recoveries, but there was always a shadow behind the praise. For every patient who improved, there was another who grew quiet and withdrawn, their eyes dull, their voices flat. Some stopped speaking altogether, staring at the ceiling for hours on end. The nurses called it the hush, and they dreaded seeing it in their patients. The doctor, with no name, kept meticulous notes. He carried a small, leather-bound notebook everywhere he went, jotting down observations in his precise, spidery handwriting. No one was allowed to see his notes, not even the head nurse. When asked about his methods, he would simply say, "Observation and patience. The body tells us what it needs if we listen closely enough." But the nurses knew there was more to it than that. They saw the way he watched his patients, the way he seemed to study them as if they were puzzles to be solved. One evening, Nurse Clara was assigned to assist him during his rounds. She was nervous, her hands shaking as she followed him from room to room. He moved quickly, barely glancing at the charts, his attention focused entirely on the patients. In room 7, he stopped beside a young boy with a high fever. He placed his hand on the boy's forehead, closed his eyes, and stood perfectly still for several minutes. When he opened his eyes, he whispered something in the boy's ear. The boy's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he smiled. Clara felt a surge of hope. But the next day, the boy was gone. The official record said he had been transferred to another hospital, but no one ever saw him leave. Clara tried to ask the doctor about it, but he cut her off with a single, icy glance. "You are here to assist, not to question," he said. His words were soft, but there was steel in them. Clara nodded, her cheeks burning with shame and fear. The other staff members began to avoid the doctor whenever possible. They took the long way around the East Wing, made excuses to switch shifts, and whispered prayers under their breath when they had to work with him. But the hospital director was impressed by the doctor's results. He gave him full control of Ward C, allowing him to choose his own staff and set his own rules. The other doctors grumbled, but they couldn't argue with the numbers. The recovery rate in Ward C was higher than anywhere else in the hospital. But the price of those recoveries was high. The patients who didn't improve seemed to fade away, their personalities erased, their memories lost. Some wandered the halls at night, muttering to themselves, their eyes empty. Others refused to eat or speak, wasting away in their beds. The nurses did their best to care for them, but nothing seemed to help. One night, Nurse Evelyn found herself alone in the ward with the doctor. She was checking on an elderly woman who had been admitted with pneumonia. The woman was restless, tossing and turning in her bed, her breathing labored. Evelyn tried to soothe her, but the woman grabbed her arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't let him take me," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Please don't let him." Before Evelyn could respond, the doctor appeared at her side. He placed a hand on the woman's forehead, and she immediately fell silent. Her eyes closing as if she had been drugged, Evelyn stared at him, her heart pounding. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The doctor looked at her, his expression unreadable. She needed rest, he said. That's all. Evelyn wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, but she couldn't find the words. She felt as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff looking down into darkness. She left the room, her hands shaking, and didn't return until morning. The next day, the woman was gone. The official record said she had been discharged, but her bed was still warm when Evelyn checked it. Her belongings were still in the drawer, her slippers neatly placed beside the bed. Evelyn asked the head nurse about it, but she just shook her head. "Don't ask questions you don't want answered," she said. The fear among the staff grew with each passing day. The doctor's presence seemed to cast a shadow over the entire ward. The patients grew quieter, the nurses more anxious. Some began to have nightmares, visions of dark corridors, locked doors, and faces they couldn't quite remember. A few even claimed to see the doctor in their dreams, standing at the foot of their beds, watching them with those cold, unblinking eyes. The hospital director remained oblivious to the growing unease. He praised the doctor's work and staff meetings, citing the improved recovery rates and the positive feedback from patients' families. He dismissed the nurses' concerns as superstition, the result of overwork and stress. But the nurses knew better. They saw the fear in each other's eyes, heard the whispers in the break room, felt the tension in the air. One afternoon, a group of nurses gathered in the break room, their voices low and urgent. They shared stories of patients who had vanished, of strange noises in the night, of the doctor's odd behavior. Some wanted to go to the hospital director to demand an investigation. Others were too afraid. They knew what happened to people who asked too many questions. Nurse Margaret listened in silence, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea. She remembered the night the doors had closed, the sound of the locks clicking into place, the screams that echoed through the halls. She remembered the doctor's notebook, the last entry. Tonight is the night. The experiment begins. No one must interfere. She wondered what kind of experiment could cause so much fear, so much pain. As the days passed, the atmosphere in Ward C grew heavier, more oppressive. The patients seemed to sense it, their eyes darting nervously whenever the doctor entered the room. Some refused to let him touch them, shrinking away from his outstretched hand. Others submitted quietly, their faces blank, their voices flat. The doctor's methods became more secretive. He began to conduct his treatments late at night, after the other staff had gone home. The nurses who worked the night shift reported seeing strange lights under the doors, hearing muffled voices and the hum of machines. One nurse claimed to have seen the doctor wheeling a patient down the hallway in the middle of the night. But when she checked the records, there was no mention of a transfer. The fear among the staff reached a breaking point. Some began to call in sick, unable to face another night in the ward. Others requested transfers to other departments, willing to take pay cuts just to escape the East Wing. The hospital director grew frustrated, but the doctor remained calm, his expression unchanged. One evening, Nurse Clara found herself alone in the break room with the doctor. She tried to avoid his gaze, but he sat down across from her, his eyes fixed on her face. "You seem troubled, Nurse Clara," he said, his voice soft and even. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling. "It's just the patients. They're afraid. The staff is afraid. No one knows what's happening in Ward C." The doctor smiled, but it was a cold, empty smile. Fear is a natural response to the unknown, but progress requires courage. Sometimes we must do things that others do not understand. Clara wanted to argue, to demand answers, but she couldn't find the words. She felt as if she were being pulled into a whirlpool, unable to escape. The doctor stood up, his coat rustling softly. "Trust me, Nurse Clara," he said. "Everything I do is for the good of the patients. You'll see." With that, he left the room, leaving Clara alone with her fear. The days turned into weeks, and the tension in the hospital grew unbearable. The staff moved through the halls like ghosts, their faces drawn, their eyes hollow. The patients in Ward C grew quieter, their voices fading to whispers. The doctor continued his work, his notebook always at his side, his eyes always watching. And then, one night, the doors of Ward C closed for the last time. No one saw the doctor leave. No one saw the patients again. The only thing left behind was a faint, lingering scream that seemed to echo through the walls, a reminder of the fear and pain that had taken root in the heart of St. Augustine's Hospital. The doctor with no name had come and gone, leaving behind a legacy of mystery and terror. The staff who remained never spoke of him again, but the memory of his cold, unblinking eyes haunted them for the rest of their lives. And so the legend of the doctor's secret ward grew, fed by fear and curiosity. A story whispered in the dark corners of the hospital, a secret that would never be forgotten. The doctor's secrets didn't just haunt the living. They left whispers in the very walls. What did the staff hear after the ward was sealed? And why did some nurses vanish without a trace? The next chapter will take you deeper into the hospital's haunted corridors, where every shadow hides a secret. Stay with us. If you crave more chilling mysteries, subscribe now and explore our other stories on Sanctified Secrets. The days after the sealing of Ward C passed in a haze of confusion and dread. The hospital's routines continued, but nothing felt normal. The staff moved through the halls with forced smiles and nervous glances, as if the very walls were listening. The East Wing, once a place of healing and hope, had become a forbidden zone. A place where even the bravest nurses refused to linger after dark. It started with the whispers. At first, they were easy to dismiss. The hospital was an old building, after all, with pipes that groaned and floors that creaked. But these sounds were different. They came at odd hours in the dead of night, when the rest of the world was silent. Nurses on the night shift would pause in their round, straining to hear. Sometimes it was a faint murmur, like a conversation just out of reach. Other times it was a single word repeated over and over. Help, help, help. Nurse Margaret was among the first to notice. She had always prided herself on her calm demeanor, her ability to handle even the most difficult patients. But the events of the past week had shaken her. She found herself jumping at every sound, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. One night, as she was making her rounds, she heard it, a soft, desperate whisper coming from behind the sealed doors of Ward C. She stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. The voice was so faint she almost thought she imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Please, let us out." Margaret pressed her ear to the door, her breath fogging the cold glass. The voice was joined by others, a chorus of pleading and sobbing. She felt a chill run down her spine. She wanted to run, to call for help, but she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear and curiosity. Suddenly, the voices stopped. The silence was deafening. Margaret stumbled back, her hands shaking. She forced herself to finish her rounds, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She wasn't the only one. Other nurses began to report strange occurrences. Footsteps echoing in empty corridors, shadows flitting across the walls, doors that opened and closed on their own. Some claimed to see faces pressed against the frosted glass of the sealed ward, their eyes wide with terror. Others heard laughter, high, brittle, and utterly joyless. The hospital administration dismissed these reports as stress-induced hallucinations. "You're all overworked," the director said, his voice tight with irritation. "Take a day off, get some rest." But the nurses knew what they had seen and heard. They whispered among themselves, sharing stories in hushed tones, afraid to speak too loudly, lest the walls themselves overhear. The patients, too, were affected. Those in rooms near the east wing began to complain of nightmares. They dreamed of endless corridors, of locked doors, and faceless doctors. Some woke up screaming, their sheets soaked with sweat. Others refused to sleep at all, their eyes red and haunted. One patient, a young woman named Lila, became convinced that something was trying to communicate with her. She would sit by her window for hours, staring at the sealed doors, her lips moving in silent conversation. When asked what she was doing, she would only smile and say, "Listening." The staff grew increasingly uneasy. Some began to avoid the East Wing altogether, making excuses to switch shifts or take their breaks elsewhere. Others tried to rationalize what was happening. "It's just the wind," they said. "Old buildings make strange noises." But deep down, they knew the truth. The hospital was haunted, not by ghosts, but by the memories of what had happened in Ward C. The tension reached a breaking point one night when a young nurse named Clara decided to investigate. Clara was new to the hospital, eager to prove herself. She had heard the stories, of course, but she didn't believe in ghosts. She believed in science, in facts and evidence. So when she heard the whispers, she told herself it was just her imagination. But curiosity got the better of her. It was just after midnight when Clara found herself standing in front of the sealed doors. The hallway was empty, the only light coming from a flickering bulb overhead. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She pressed her ear to the door. At first there was nothing, just the sound of her own breathing, the distant hum of the hospital's machinery. But then, slowly, the whispers began. They were soft at first, barely more than a sigh, but they grew louder, more insistent, until Clara could make out words. "Help us. Please. It hurts." Clara's blood ran cold. She wanted to run, to scream, but she couldn't move. She was trapped, caught between fear and fascination. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. In their place was a single, piercing scream, a sound so raw and desperate that it seemed to shake the very walls. Clara stumbled back, her hands clamped over her ears. She ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She didn't stop until she reached the head nurse's office. She burst through the door, her face white with terror. "I heard them," she gasped. "The patients. They're still in there. They're calling for help." The head nurse looked at her with a mixture of pity and fear. She closed the door and drew the curtains, shutting out the rest of the hospital. "Sit down, Clara," she said gently. "You're not the first to hear them. But you mustn't tell anyone. The director won't listen, and the other staff are already on edge. We have to keep this quiet." Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. She felt a deep sense of shame, as if she had failed some unspoken test. She wanted to go home, to forget what she had heard, but she knew she never would. The next day, Clara was transferred to another hospital. She never spoke of that night again. The story of Clara's experience spread quickly among the staff. Some dismissed it as a nervous breakdown, the result of too many long shifts and too little sleep. Others believed every word. They began to avoid the East Wing even more, refusing to go near the sealed doors after dark. The hospital administration tried to contain the rumors, but it was too late. The legend of the doctor's secret ward had taken on a life of its own. It was around this time that a video began to circulate among the staff. A grainy black-and-white recording made by a group of amateur ghost hunters who had snuck into the hospital late one night. The video, titled "The Creepiest Hospital Mystery, the Ward That Time Forgot," showed the investigators wandering the empty halls, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. They paused in front of the sealed doors, their voices hushed. "Do you hear that?" one of them whispered. The camera zoomed in on the door. For a moment there was nothing. Then faintly, the sound of whispering, soft, desperate, pleading. The investigators exchanged nervous glances, their faces pale in the dim light. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the hallway and the camera jerked wildly. The video ended abruptly, the screen going black. The staff watched the video in silence, their faces drawn and tense. Some laughed nervously, trying to brush it off as a prank. But others weren't so sure. The whispers in the video matched what they had heard themselves. The fear was real, and it was spreading. The hospital director tried to ban the video, threatening disciplinary action against anyone caught sharing it. But the damage was done. The story of the doctor's secret ward had gone viral, spreading beyond the hospital walls to the wider community. Local newspapers picked up the story, running headlines like "Haunted Hospital, the Mystery of the Sealed Ward," and "Whispers in the Walls, Patients Plead for Help." Reporters camped outside the hospital, hoping for a glimpse of the infamous East Wing. The hospital administration issued a statement denying any wrongdoing, insisting that the ward had been closed for renovations. But no one believed them. The families of the missing patients demanded answers. They held vigils outside the hospital, holding up photographs of their loved ones and chanting, "Open the doors! Tell us the truth!" The hospital director refused to meet with them, citing ongoing investigations. The police were called to disperse the crowds, but the protests continued. Inside the hospital, the staff were caught in a nightmare. They were afraid to speak out, afraid to lose their jobs, but they couldn't ignore what was happening. Some began to keep journals, documenting the strange occurrences in the East Wing. Others confided in each other, sharing their fears in whispered conversations. One nurse, Evelyn, wrote in her diary, "I hear them every night. The whispers, the cries for help. I try to tell myself it's just my imagination, but I know it's real. Something terrible happened in that ward, and the walls remember." The fear began to take its toll. Nurses called in sick, unable to face another night in the hospital. Patients requested transfers to other facilities, unwilling to stay in a place so steeped in mystery and dread. The hospital's reputation suffered, and the director grew increasingly desperate to contain the situation. But the whispers continued. Some nights they were so loud that even patients in the farthest wings could hear them. The staff tried to drown them out with music, with laughter, with anything that would break the silence. But nothing worked. The whispers seeped through the walls, through the floors, through the very air. One night a group of nurses gathered in the break room, their faces pale and drawn. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices trembling. "I saw a face in the window," one said. "It was pressed against the glass, staring at me. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. It was like it was begging me to help." "I heard footsteps behind me," another whispered. "I turned around, but no one was there. I could feel someone watching me, breathing down my neck." "I had a dream," a third nurse said, her voice barely audible. "I was trapped in the ward, the doors locked. I could hear the doctor's voice telling me to be quiet, to forget, but I couldn't. I woke up screaming." The nurses clung to each other, their fear palpable. They knew they couldn't go to the administration. They were on their own. As the weeks passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The staff began to wonder if the walls themselves were alive, if they had absorbed the pain and fear of the patients who had vanished. Some believed the spirits of the lost were trying to communicate, to tell their stories. Others thought it was a warning, a sign that something terrible was about to happen. The hospital director, desperate to restore order, called in a team of experts. Psychologists, engineers, even a priest. They examined the East Wing, searching for logical explanations. They found nothing. The walls were solid, the doors secure. There was no evidence of tampering, no signs of a hoax. The priest performed a blessing, sprinkling holy water on the doors and reciting prayers. For a few days, the whispers seemed to fade, but then they returned, louder than ever. The staff began to lose hope. They knew the truth would never come out, that the hospital would never admit what had happened. The whispers in the walls were all that remained, a haunting reminder of the secrets that had been buried, the lives that had been lost. And so the legend of the doctor's secret ward grew, fed by fear and curiosity, a story whispered in the dark corners of the hospital, a secret that would never be forgotten. If you think the whispers were terrifying, wait until you discover what the hospital tried to erase. What happens when families demand answers and the records themselves disappear? The next chapter uncovers a cover-up so complete it almost erased the truth forever. Don't blink. Subscribe to Sanctified Secrets and keep watching, because the deeper we go, the darker it gets. The legend of the doctor's secret ward was no longer just a whisper among the staff. It had become a shadow that stretched far beyond the hospital's walls, reaching into the homes of the city's residents and the hearts of the families who had lost loved ones. The sealed doors of Ward C were now a symbol of unanswered questions, and the hospital's silence only deepened the mystery. But as the weeks turned into months, a new layer of the story began to emerge, one that would shake the very foundation of St. Augustine's Hospital. It started with a simple request. A mother, desperate for closure, asked to see her son's medical records. She wanted to know what had happened to him in those final days, to understand why he had been taken from her so suddenly. The hospital's response was polite but firm. "We're sorry, but those records are unavailable at this time." At first, she accepted the explanation. Hospitals were busy places, and paperwork could easily be misplaced. But as she spoke to other families, she realized she was not alone. Every family who had lost someone in Ward C received the same answer. The records were missing, lost, or destroyed. There was no explanation, no apology, just a wall of silence. The families began to organize, meeting in church basements and community centers, sharing their stories and their grief. They wrote letters to the hospital administration, to the city council, to anyone who would listen. They demanded answers, but none were given. The hospital director, once so visible and reassuring, now avoided public appearances. His statements were brief and carefully worded, offering sympathy but no substance. Inside the hospital, the staff were caught in a web of fear and suspicion. Some believed the administration was hiding something terrible. Others thought it was all a misunderstanding, a bureaucratic error that would soon be corrected. But as the days passed and the records remained missing, doubt began to creep in. Nurse Margaret, who had been at the hospital for over a decade, decided to investigate on her own. She knew the hospital's filing system better than anyone, having spent countless hours organizing charts and updating records. She started with the basics, checking the logbooks for the week of the incident. But when she opened the cabinet, she found a gap. An entire section of the logbook was missing, the pages torn out with surgical precision. Her heart pounding, Margaret moved on to the patient files. She searched for the names of those who had been in Ward C, but their folders were gone. In their place were empty slots, as if the patients had never existed. She checked the discharge records, the transfer logs, even the morgue reports. Nothing. It was as if a ghost had swept through the hospital, erasing every trace of those who had vanished. Margaret confided in a trusted colleague, Nurse Evelyn, who agreed to help. Together, they searched the hospital's archives, digging through boxes of old paperwork and dusty ledgers. They found records for every other ward, every other patient, but nothing for Ward C. The only clue was a single, cryptic note in the margin of an old staff roster. See doctor for details. The name was smudged, unreadable, but Margaret knew who it referred to. The doctor with no name. Determined to find the truth, Margaret and Evelyn decided to search the doctor's office. It had been locked since the night the ward was sealed, but Margaret had a key, an old skeleton key she had found in the supply closet years ago. Late one night, when the hospital was quiet, they slipped into the east wing and unlocked the door. The office was exactly as the doctor had left it. The desk was covered in papers, medical charts, and a single half-empty cup of tea. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from a small lamp on the desk. Margaret and Evelyn began to search, opening drawers and rifling through files. At first they found nothing unusual, just the usual paperwork, neatly organized and meticulously labeled. But as they dug deeper, they discovered a hidden compartment in the bottom drawer. Inside was a stack of notebooks, bound in black leather, and filled with the doctor's spidery handwriting. The entries were clinical, almost cold. They described the patients in Ward C, their symptoms, their treatments. But as Margaret read, she realized something was wrong. The notes were incomplete, with entire sections blacked out or torn away. Some entries ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if the doctor had been interrupted. Others were written in a code that neither Margaret nor Evelyn could decipher. But one entry stood out. It was dated the night the ward was sealed. Experiment proceeding as planned. Patients responding to treatment, some resistance but manageable. Must ensure no interference. Records to be secured. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She turned the page, but the rest of the entry had been ripped out. Evelyn found a second notebook hidden behind a stack of medical journals. This one was different, less clinical, more personal. The handwriting was shaky, the words hurried. They're watching me. I can feel their eyes. The patients know something is wrong. I must finish before they stop me. The director suspects, but he won't act. He's afraid. We're all afraid. The final entry was a single word scrawled in large, uneven letters. Run. Margaret and Evelyn exchanged a look of fear and determination. They knew they had found something important, something the hospital didn't want anyone to see. But they also knew they were in danger. They quickly copied the most important pages and returned the notebooks to their hiding place. The next day, Margaret tried to show the copies to the hospital director. She waited outside his office for hours, but he never appeared. When she finally managed to speak to his secretary, she was told he was unavailable and that she should focus on her duties. The message was clear. Stop asking questions. But Margaret couldn't let it go. She shared the copies with the families of the missing patients, who were grateful but frustrated. The notes raised more questions than they answered. What was the experiment? Why were the records destroyed? Who was protecting the doctor? The families took their fight to the city council, demanding a formal investigation. The council agreed to look into the matter, but the hospital administration stonewalled at every turn. They claimed the records had been lost in a fire, that the missing pages were the result of routine maintenance. They refused to allow outside investigators access to the sealed ward, citing safety concerns. The city's health department launched its own inquiry, but quickly ran into the same obstacles. The hospital's logbooks for the week of the incident were missing. Patient files had been shredded. Even the city's own records showed no trace of the patients admitted to Ward C. It was as if the entire ward had been erased from history. The families were devastated. They had hoped for closure, for answers, but instead they were met with lies and obfuscation. Some began to lose hope, convinced they would never know the truth. Others grew angry, organizing protests and demanding the resignation of the hospital director. The media seized on the story, running headlines like, "Hospital Cover-Up, the Missing Patients of Ward C," and "Where Are the Records? Families Demand Answers." Reporters camped outside the hospital, interviewing anyone who would talk. The hospital administration issued a series of bland statements, insisting that all appropriate procedures had been followed, and that the safety and privacy of our patients is our top priority. But the public wasn't convinced. The more the hospital tried to hide, the more people wanted to know. The legend of the doctor's secret ward grew, fueled by rumors and speculation. Inside the hospital, the staff were caught in the crossfire. Some were sympathetic to the families, quietly sharing what little information they had. Others were loyal to the administration, convinced that the rumors were exaggerated. But everyone was afraid. The fear was palpable, a living thing that crept through the halls and settled in the hearts of those who worked there. Nurse Evelyn began to have nightmares. She dreamed of locked doors and endless corridors, of patients calling her name from behind the walls. She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart racing. She tried to talk to Margaret about it, but Margaret was growing distant, consumed by her own obsession with the missing records. One night, Evelyn stayed late to finish her paperwork. The hospital was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the heating system. She was about to leave when she heard a noise, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the east wing. She hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. She knew she should go home, but something compelled her to investigate. She walked down the darkened hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. As she approached the sealed doors of Ward C, she heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible. She pressed her ear to the door, her breath fogging the glass. "Help us, please. Don't let them forget." Evelyn stumbled back, her heart pounding. She ran down the hallway, not stopping until she reached the safety of the nurse's station. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but she knew the truth. The patients were still there, trapped in the walls, their voices lost to history. The next day, Evelyn found a note in her locker. It was written in the same shaky handwriting as the doctor's notebook. "They're watching. Be careful." She showed the note to Margaret, who paled but said nothing. The two nurses agreed to keep quiet, to stop asking questions. They knew they were being watched, that any misstep could cost them their jobs, or worse. But the legend of the missing records would not die. The families continued to fight, the media continued to dig, and the whispers in the walls grew louder. The truth was out there, just beyond reach, waiting to be uncovered. And so the mystery of the doctor's secret ward deepened. A story of fear and loss, of secrets buried and voices silenced. The missing records were more than just paperwork. They were the key to understanding what had happened in Ward C, and why the hospital would do anything to keep it hidden. But as long as the doors remained sealed, the truth would remain just out of reach, a secret whispered in the darkness, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. The missing records were just the beginning. What if some patients survived, and their stories were more disturbing than anyone could imagine? In the next chapter, you'll hear from those who escaped the ward, and what they reveal will change everything you thought you knew. If you're hooked, hit subscribe and check out our other mysteries on Sanctified Secrets. The legend of the doctor's secret ward had grown into a storm of rumors, protests, and unanswered questions. But as the years passed, the world outside St. Augustine's Hospital began to move on. The city changed, new buildings rose, and the hospital itself expanded, swallowing up old corridors and forgotten rooms. Yet for a handful of people, the story of Ward C was not just a legend, it was a memory, a scar that never healed. They were the survivors. For decades, their voices were lost in the noise. Some were dismissed as delusional, their stories too strange to be believed. Others were too afraid to speak, haunted by nightmares and the fear that someone was still watching. But as the whispers in the walls grew louder and the families of the missing demanded answers, a few survivors found the courage to come forward. Their stories were not all the same. Each remembered the events of that fateful night in their own way, colored by fear, confusion, and the passage of time. But certain details echoed from one account to the next, details that could not be ignored. Henry's story. Henry was the first to speak. He was an old man now, his hair white and his hands trembling, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He had been a young soldier, wounded in a factory accident, when he was admitted to Ward C. He remembered the pain, the endless nights of fever and fear. But most of all, he remembered the doctor. He was always there, Henry said, his voice low and steady. He never slept, never ate. He'd just stand at the end of my bed, watching. Sometimes he'd ask questions, strange questions about my childhood, my dreams. Other times, he'd just stare like he was waiting for something. Henry's memories of the night the doors were sealed were fragmented, like pieces of a broken mirror. He remembered the sound of the locks clicking, the sudden silence that fell over the ward. He remembered the other patients, some crying, some praying, some pounding on the doors until their hands bled. But what haunted Henry most was the treatment. "They strapped me to the bed," he said, his voice shaking. "I couldn't move. The doctor came in with a machine, something I'd never seen before. It hummed like a beehive. He put something on my head, and then, I don't know. I felt like I was falling, like I was being pulled apart. I tried to scream, but no sound came out." When Henry woke, the ward was empty. The doors were open, the beds were stripped, and the doctor was gone. He stumbled into the hallway, dazed and weak, and was found by a nurse who didn't recognize him. His name was missing from the records, and for weeks the hospital insisted he had never been a patient. Henry left the city soon after, but the nightmares followed him. He dreamed of locked doors and endless corridors, of doctors' cold eyes and the hum of the machine. For years he kept his story to himself, afraid no one would believe him. But when he saw the news reports about the missing records, he knew he had to speak. "I don't know what happened to the others," he said, tears in his eyes. "But I know what I saw. The doctor was doing something to us, something terrible. And the hospital helped him cover it up." Martha's story. Martha was a quiet woman, her voice barely more than a whisper. She had been a patient in Ward C for a minor infection, but her stay had turned into a nightmare. She remembered the fear that gripped the ward in the days before the doors were sealed, the way the nurses avoided eye contact, the way the other patients grew silent and withdrawn. But what Martha remembered most was the sense of being watched. "It was like there were eyes everywhere," she said. "Not just the doctors, but something else. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and feel like someone was standing over me, even when the room was empty." Martha's memories of the treatment were hazy. She remembered being given injections that made her feel numb and confused. She remembered the doctor's voice, calm and cold, telling her to relax, to let go. She remembered the other patients, some screaming, some silent, as the doctor moved from bed to bed. When the doors were finally opened, Martha was found wandering the halls, her hospital gown stained with blood. She had no memory of how she got there, and for weeks she was unable to speak. The hospital transferred her to a psychiatric facility where she spent months recovering. Martha's family was told she had suffered a nervous breakdown, that her memories were the result of trauma and confusion. But Martha knew the truth. She had seen things in Ward C that no one should ever see. "I still hear the whispers," she said, her eyes filling with tears. Sometimes, late at night, I hear them calling my name. David's story. David was a teenager when he was admitted to Ward C, suffering from a high fever and hallucinations. He remembered the fear in his mother's eyes as she left him in the care of the hospital, the way the nurses whispered to each other when they thought he couldn't hear. David's memories of the doctor were vivid. He remembered the way the doctor's eyes seemed to glow in the dim light, the way his voice could be both soothing and terrifying. He'd sit by my bed and ask me questions, David said. Not about my illness, but about my dreams, my fears. He wanted to know what scared me, what made me happy. It was like he was trying to get inside my head. David remembered the night the doors were sealed. He remembered the panic, the screams, the way the doctor moved from bed to bed, whispering in each patient's ear. He remembered the machine, the same one Henry described, and the way it made his head feel like it was splitting open. But David also remembered something else, a moment of clarity, a flash of understanding. I saw the doctor's face, he said. For a second I saw fear, real fear. He was scared of something, too. I don't know what it was, but it was like he knew he'd gone too far. When David was finally released from the hospital, his mother barely recognized him. He was thin, pale, and withdrawn, his eyes haunted by memories he couldn't explain. For years he struggled with anxiety and depression, unable to shake the feeling that something was still watching him. But David refused to be silenced. He wrote letters to the hospital, to the city council, to anyone who would listen. He told his story to anyone who would hear it, determined to make sure the truth was never forgotten. The patterns merge. As more survivors came forward, patterns began to emerge. Each described the same doctor, the same fear, the same sense of being watched. Each remembered the machine, the injections, the feeling of being trapped and helpless. But there were differences, too. Some survivors remembered details that others did not. A song the doctor hummed under his breath, a phrase he repeated over and over, a symbol carved into the wall above their beds. Some remembered other patients, faces and names that had been erased from the records. Others remembered nothing at all, their memories wiped clean by whatever had happened in Ward C. The hospital administration dismissed the survivors' stories as the result of trauma and suggestion. They pointed to the lack of records, the inconsistencies in the accounts, the passage of time. But the survivors knew what they had experienced. They knew the truth. The families of the missing patients rallied around the survivors, organizing support groups and public forums. They shared their own stories, their own memories of loved ones who had vanished without a trace. They demanded answers, but the hospital remained silent. The media seized on the survivors' stories, running headlines like, "Survivors Speak," "The Truth About Ward C," and "Haunted by the Past." The patients who escaped the doctor's secret ward. Reporters interviewed the survivors on camera, their faces blurred to protect their identities. The public was riveted, drawn in by the mystery and the horror. But for the survivors, the attention was a double-edged sword. Some found comfort in sharing their stories, in knowing they were not alone. Others found the memories too painful to revisit, the nightmares too real to escape. The trauma lingers. The trauma of Ward C lingered long after the doors were sealed. Many survivors struggled with mental health issues, anxiety, depression, PTSD. Some turned to drugs or alcohol to numb the pain. Others withdrew from the world, unable to trust anyone, afraid that the doctor or something worse was still out there. A few survivors found solace in each other, forming a small, tight-knit group. They met in secret, sharing their memories and their fears. They compared notes, trying to piece together what had happened in Ward C. They searched for answers, for closure, for justice. But the truth remained elusive. The hospital refused to release any information. The records were still missing, and the doctor had vanished without a trace. The survivors were left with only their memories, their scars, and the knowledge that they had survived something no one else could understand. A glimmer of hope. Despite the pain, there was a glimmer of hope. The survivors' stories had forced the hospital to confront its past, to acknowledge the suffering that had been hidden for so long. The families of the missing patients continued to fight, their voices growing louder with each passing year. And the legend of the doctor's secret ward lived on, a reminder that some secrets cannot be buried, that the truth will always find a way to the surface. For the survivors, the journey was far from over, but they were no longer alone. They had each other, and they had the courage to speak the truth, no matter how painful. As Henry said, "We survived. That's what matters. We survived, and we remember. And as long as we remember, the doctor can't hurt anyone else." The survivors' memories are chilling, but one nurse risked everything to write down the truth. What did she see, and why did her final words warn, "If you find this, run"? The next chapter reveals the lost diary that reignited the legend. Don't miss it. Subscribe to Sanctified Secrets and dive into more stories that will keep you up at night. The story of the doctor's secret ward had always been told from the outside, by the families who lost loved ones, the survivors who escaped, and the staff who whispered in the shadows. But what if there was a voice from within? A voice that had witnessed the truth, recorded it in real time, and left behind a record for the world to find. That voice belonged to Nurse Evelyn. Evelyn had been a nurse at St. Augustine's for nearly 5 years when the events in Ward C unfolded. She was known for her gentle touch and her unwavering dedication to her patients. She was the kind of nurse who remembered birthdays, who brought extra blankets on cold nights, who sat with the dying so they wouldn't be alone. But beneath her calm exterior, Evelyn was deeply troubled by what she saw in the hospital's East Wing. She had always kept a diary, a habit she'd picked up in nursing school, a way to process the long hours and the emotional toll of her work. At first, her entries were mundane, notes about difficult patients, funny stories from the break room, worries about her aging parents. But as the atmosphere in Ward C began to change, so did her writing. The diary, discovered decades later by a construction crew renovating the old hospital, would become the most important piece of evidence in the mystery of the doctor's secret ward. It was hidden behind a loose brick in the wall of the old nurses' station, wrapped in a faded scarf and tied with a piece of twine. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the words were still legible, a haunting record of fear, confusion, and courage. The first signs. Evelyn's early entries from the summer of 1910 were filled with unease. She wrote about the arrival of the new doctor, his cold demeanor, and the way he seemed to unsettle everyone around him. July 3rd, 1910. The new doctor started today. He's very quiet, but there's something about him that makes me nervous. The patients seem to sense it too. I saw Mrs. Hargrove flinch when he walked by her bed. I hope I'm just being silly. July 10th, 1910. Strange things are happening in Ward C. Patients who are getting better are suddenly getting worse. Others are improving overnight, almost as if by magic. The doctor keeps detailed notes, but he won't let anyone see them. I asked him about Mr. Collins' treatment, and he just stared at me. I felt like I was being studied. July 15, 1910. I had a nightmare last night. I was trapped in the ward, the doors locked. I could hear the patients screaming, but I couldn't move. When I woke up, I was crying. I've never felt this way before. The fear grows. As the weeks passed, Evelyn's entries grew darker. She wrote about the fear that gripped the staff, the way the other nurses avoided the East Wing, the strange noises that echoed through the halls at night. August 2nd, 1910. The whispers are getting louder. I hear them when I'm alone in the corridor, when I'm trying to sleep. Sometimes I think I see shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. I asked Margaret if she's noticed anything, but she just shook her head. I think she's afraid to talk about it. August 8th, 1910. The doctor is working late every night. I see lights under his office door, hear the hum of machines. I tried to ask him what he's doing, but he told me to mind my own business. I'm starting to think he's hiding something. August 12th, 1910. One of the patients, Henry, begged me not to leave him alone with the doctor. He said the doctor was doing things to him, things he couldn't remember. I tried to comfort him, but I was scared too. I feel so helpless. The night the doors closed. Evelyn's account of the night the doors were sealed is the most detailed and chilling part of her diary. She describes the chaos, the fear, and the sense that something terrible was happening just out of sight. September 1st, 1910. Tonight was the worst night of my life. The doors to Ward C were locked from the inside. I heard the locks click, one after another, like a chain reaction. The patients started to panic, banging on the doors, screaming for help. I tried to calm them, but I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. The doctor was nowhere to be found. I checked his office, but it was empty. His notebook was gone. I heard strange noises coming from the treatment room, a low humming, like a machine running. I wanted to go in, but something stopped me. I felt like I was being watched. The screaming went on for hours. I tried to cover my ears, but it was no use. The sound was everywhere, inside my head, in my bones. I thought I was going to lose my mind. And then, just before dawn, everything went silent. The patient stopped screaming. The humming stopped. The only sound was my own breathing, ragged and desperate. I don't know what happened in that room. I don't want to know. The aftermath. In the days that followed, Evelyn's entries are filled with guilt and confusion. She writes about the hospital's attempts to cover up the incident, the missing records, and the fear that gripped the staff. September 3rd, 1910. The hospital director told us not to talk about what happened. He said it was for our own good, that the patients' families didn't need to know the details. I feel sick. I keep seeing their faces, hearing their voices. I can't sleep. September 5th, 1910. Margaret is acting strange. She won't look me in the eye. I think she knows more than she's saying. I found her in the records room, going through the files. She said she was just organizing, but I don't believe her. September 10th, 1910. The other nurses are starting to leave. Clara transferred to another hospital. Mrs. Jenkins quit. I want to leave too, but I can't. I feel like I have to stay to make sure the truth isn't forgotten. The final days. As the weeks passed, Evelyn's entries became more frantic. She wrote about the nightmares that haunted her, the sense that the hospital was closing in around her, the fear that she was being watched. September 20th, 1910. I can't take it anymore. The whispers are everywhere. I see the doctor's face in my dreams, hear his voice in the hallways. I think he's still here, hiding in the shadows. I'm afraid to be alone. September 22nd, 1910. I found a note in my locker today. It said, "Don't ask questions." I don't know who left it. I'm scared. September 25th, 1910. I'm going to hide this diary. If anyone finds it, please believe me. Something terrible happened in Ward C. The doctor was doing experiments on the patients. The hospital covered it up. The truth is in these pages. September 26, 1910. If you find this, run. The diary's discovery. The discovery of Evelyn's diary decades later sent shockwaves through the community. The construction crew that found it was working on a renovation project, tearing down old walls to make way for a new wing. One of the workers noticed a loose brick and pried it free, revealing the diary hidden inside. At first, the crew thought it was just an old notebook, a relic from the hospital's past. But as they read the entries, they realized they had found something extraordinary. A first-hand account of the events in Ward C, written by someone who had lived through it. The diary was turned over to the authorities, who launched a new investigation into the hospital's past. The media seized on the story, running headlines like, "Nurse's Diary Reveals Hospital's Darkest Secret," and "The Truth About the Doctor's Secret Ward." The public was riveted, drawn in by the raw emotion and the chilling details. For the families of the missing patients, the diary was both a blessing and a curse. It confirmed their worst fears, but it also gave them a sense of closure, a record of what had happened, written by someone who had cared. For the survivors, the diary was a lifeline. It validated their memories, their pain, their trauma. It proved that they were not alone, that someone else had seen what they had seen, felt what they had felt. The hospital's response. The hospital administration was quick to downplay the diary's significance. They claimed it was the work of a troubled employee, that the events described were exaggerated or imagined. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence, the missing records, the passage of time. But the public was not convinced. The diary's details matched the survivors' stories, the families' memories, the rumors that had circulated for decades. The hospital's attempts to discredit Evelyn only made the story more compelling. The city council launched a new inquiry demanding access to the sealed ward and the hospital's archives. The hospital resisted, citing safety concerns and patient privacy. But the pressure was mounting, and it was clear that the truth would not stay buried forever. The legacy of the diary. Evelyn's diary became a symbol of courage and truth, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are those who will risk everything to do what is right. Her words inspired others to come forward, to share their own stories, to demand justice for the victims of Ward C. The diary was eventually published, its pages reproduced in newspapers and online forums. Readers were moved by Evelyn's honesty, her compassion, her fear. They saw themselves in her words, felt her pain, her hope, her determination. For the staff who remained at St. Augustine's, the diary was a wake-up call. It forced them to confront the hospital's past, to acknowledge the suffering that had been hidden for so long. Some left, unable to bear the weight of the truth. Others stayed, determined to make sure that nothing like Ward C would ever happen again. A voice from the past. Evelyn's diary ended with a plea, a hope that someone would find her words, believe her story, and seek the truth. In the years that followed, her voice echoed through the halls of St. Augustine's, a reminder that the past cannot be erased, that the truth will always find a way to the surface. Her final words, scrawled in shaky handwriting, became a rallying cry for those who sought justice. If you find this, run. But for those who read her diary, running was not an option. They were determined to stand and fight, to uncover the secrets of the doctor's secret ward, and to make sure that Evelyn's courage was never forgotten. The diary's secrets shook the city, but the hospital's most terrifying legacy was yet to come. What if the screams never stopped, and some say they still echo in the halls today? Next, we'll explore the scream that haunted generations. If you want to know what really happened, Subscribe and keep watching Sanctified Secrets for more haunted histories. The legend of the doctor's secret ward had always been shrouded in whispers and shadows, but there was one part of the story that no one could ignore: the scream. It was a sound that seemed to echo through the very bones of St. Augustine's Hospital, a sound that refused to fade, no matter how many years passed or how many walls were built to contain it. For those who lived and worked near the hospital, the scream was more than just a rumor. It was a living, breathing presence, a reminder that some wounds never heal and some secrets never die. The first night. It began on the night the doors to Ward C were sealed. The staff who were there would never forget it. The patients' cries for help, the pounding on the doors, the desperate pleas that faded into silence. But just as dawn broke, a single, piercing scream cut through the quiet. A scream so raw and desperate that it seemed to shake the very foundation of the hospital. Nurse Margaret, who had been standing in the hallway outside Ward C, would later describe it as the sound of a soul being torn apart. She covered her ears, but the scream seemed to come from inside her own head, vibrating through her bones and leaving her gasping for breath. Others heard it too. Doctors, nurses, even patients in distant wings. Some said it was a woman's voice, others a man's. Some said it was the voice of a child. But all agreed on one thing. It was a sound they would never forget: the echoes. In the days and weeks that followed, the scream became a part of the hospital's daily life. It was heard at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes in the quiet of the afternoon. It would start as a low moan, building in intensity until it reached a fever pitch, then fade away as suddenly as it had begun. The staff had tried to explain it away. Old buildings make strange noises, they said. It's just the wind, or the pipes, or the settling of the foundation. But deep down, they knew the truth. The scream was not a natural sound. It was a memory, a ghost, a wound that refused to heal. Patients began to complain of nightmares. They dreamed of locked doors and endless corridors, of faceless doctors and screaming voices. Some woke up in the middle of the night, convinced that someone was standing at the foot of their bed watching them with cold, unblinking eyes. The hospital administration tried to contain the rumors, but it was no use. The scream was too real, too persistent. It seeped into the walls, into the floors, into the very air. The paranormal investigators. As the legend of the scream grew, it began to attract attention from outside the hospital. Paranormal investigators, drawn by stories of ghosts and hauntings, began to visit St. Augustine's, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. One group, led by a local radio host named Tom Grady, decided to spend the night in the hospital. They set up cameras and audio recorders in the East Wing, just outside the sealed doors of Ward C. They interviewed staff and patients, collecting stories of strange noises and unexplained phenomena. As midnight approached, the investigators gathered in the hallway, their equipment humming quietly. They waited in silence, their nerves on edge. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the scream began. It started as a low, guttural moan, barely audible over the hum of the equipment. But it quickly grew louder, rising in pitch and intensity until it filled the entire hallway. The investigators froze, their eyes wide with fear. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard, raw, desperate, inhuman. One of the cameras captured the moment. The investigators' faces were pale and drawn, their hands shaking as they clung to each other. The scream lasted for nearly a minute, then faded away, leaving only silence. The recording was played on local radio the next day. Listeners called in, some in tears, others angry or frightened. Some claimed to recognize the voice, to hear the name of a loved one in the scream. Others said it was a warning, a sign that the hospital was cursed. The hospital administration had dismissed the recording as a hoax, but the damage was done. The legend of the scream had gone viral, spreading far beyond the city limits. The community reacts. For the people who lived near St. Augustine's, the scream became a part of daily life. Some claimed to hear it every night, drifting through open windows and echoing down empty streets. Others said it was only heard by those who had lost someone in the hospital, a private message from the other side. Children dared each other to spend the night near the hospital, to see who could last the longest before running home in terror. Teenagers told stories of seeing faces in the windows, of feeling cold hands on their shoulders, of waking up with the sound of the scream still ringing in their ears. The local church held prayer vigils, asking for peace for the souls trapped in the hospital. Some families moved away, unable to bear the constant reminders of their loss. Others stayed, determined to fight for the truth. The city council received dozens of complaints, but there was little they could do. The hospital was a private property, and the administration refused to allow any further investigations. The staff's struggle. Inside the hospital, the staff struggled to cope. Some tried to ignore the scream, focusing on their work and pretending not to hear. Others turned to alcohol or sleeping pills, desperate for a few hours of peace. A few nurses began to keep journals documenting the times and dates when the scream was heard. They compared notes, looking for patterns, for clues. Some believed the scream was a message, a cry for help from the patients who had vanished. Others thought it was a warning, a sign that the hospital was still hiding something terrible. One nurse, Anna, became obsessed with the scream. She spent her nights in the East Wing, listening for the sound, trying to record it on her phone. She interviewed patients and staff, collecting stories and rumors. She even tried to contact the families of the missing, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening. But the more Anna learned, the more frightened she became. She began to have nightmares, dreams of locked doors and endless corridors, of the doctor's cold eyes and the hum of the machine. She started to see shadows moving in the corners of her vision, to hear whispers in the empty hallways. One night, Anna disappeared. Her car was found in the hospital parking lot, her phone and notebook left behind. The staff searched the hospital from top to bottom, but there was no trace of her. Some said she had run away, unable to cope with the stress. Others believed she had been taken by the doctor, by the hospital, by whatever force was behind the scream. Her disappearance only added to the legend, fueling new rumors and new fears. The scream in the media. The story of the scream became a sensation. Newspapers ran headlines like, "The Scream That Never Stopped," and "Haunted Hospital, The Mystery of Ward C." Television crews camped outside the hospital, hoping to capture the sound on camera. Podcasts and YouTube channels devoted entire episodes to the legend, analyzing the recordings, interviewing survivors and staff, speculating about the truth behind the scream. Some claimed it was the result of a government experiment gone wrong, others that it was the work of a mad scientist. A few even suggested that the hospital was built on cursed ground, that the scream was the voice of the land itself, crying out for justice. But for those who had heard the scream, the theories didn't matter. The sound was real, and it was a wound that refused to heal. The family's pain. For the families of the missing patients, the scream was both a curse and a comfort. Some believed it was the voice of their loved ones trapped in the hospital, calling out for help. Others saw it as a sign that the truth would one day be revealed, that justice would be done. Many families began to gather outside the hospital on the anniversary of the sealing of Ward C. They held candles and photographs, sang hymns, and listened for the scream. Some claimed to hear it, others did not. But all agreed that the hospital owed them answers. One mother, Mrs. Ramirez, became the unofficial spokesperson for the group. Her son, Miguel, had been a patient in Ward C, and she had never stopped searching for the truth. She spoke to reporters, organized protests, and demanded that the hospital open the sealed ward. "The scream is a reminder," she said. "A reminder that our loved ones are not forgotten, that we will not rest until we know what happened." The hospital's silence. Despite the growing pressure, the hospital administration remained silent. They refused to comment on the scream, refused to allow further investigations, refused to acknowledge the pain of the families. Some staff believed the administration was hiding something, that they knew more than they were letting on. Others thought the hospital was simply trying to protect its reputation, to avoid lawsuits and bad publicity. But the silence only made things worse. The legend of the scream grew, spreading far beyond the city, drawing the attention of people from all over the world. A new generation. As the years passed, a new generation of staff and patients came to St. Augustine's. Many had heard the stories, but few believed them. The hospital was modernized, new wings were built, and the old East Wing was left to decay. But the scream remained. Some nights, it was as loud as ever, echoing through the empty halls, rattling the windows, waking patients from their sleep. Other nights, it was barely a whisper, a faint reminder of the past. But it was always there, a wound that refused to heal, a secret that refused to die. The scream's meaning. For some, the scream was a warning, a sign that the hospital was still hiding something terrible. For others, it was a cry for help, a plea for justice for the patients who had vanished. But for everyone who heard it, the scream was a reminder that the past cannot be buried, that the truth will always find a way to the surface. And so the legend of the doctor's secret ward lived on, carried by the scream that never stopped, a sound that echoed through the halls of St. Augustine's, through the hearts of those who had lost, through the memories of those who had survived. A sound that would not be silenced, no matter how many years passed, no matter how many walls were built to contain it. The scream was only the symptom. What was the doctor really trying to do? And what did he unleash in his final experiment? In the next chapter, we'll uncover the experiment that crossed every line. If you're ready for the truth, subscribe now and explore more dark secrets with Sanctified Secrets. The scream that haunted St. Augustine's Hospital was more than just a sound. It was a question that demanded an answer. What had happened in Ward C? What had the doctor with no name done to his patients? As the years passed and the legend grew, the truth seemed to slip further away, hidden behind missing records, sealed doors, and the silence of those who knew too much. But every secret leaves a trace, and every experiment leaves a mark. Theories and whispers. In the aftermath of the scream, theories about the doctor's true intentions multiplied like shadows at dusk. Some believed he was searching for a cure to a deadly disease, driven by desperation and genius. Others whispered that he was obsessed with the mind, determined to unlock its secrets at any cost. A few even claimed he was working for the government, conducting experiments too dangerous to be revealed. But the most persistent rumor was the strangest of all, that the doctor believed he could transfer memories from one person to another, that he was trying to erase pain, to heal trauma, to give his patients a second chance at life. But in his quest for a miracle, he had unleashed a nightmare, a letter from the past. The first real clue came years after the ward was sealed, when a letter was discovered in the hospital archives. It was written in a hurried, almost frantic hand, addressed to the hospital director but never sent. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting matched the doctor's notes. September 1st, 1910. Director. The experiment is nearly complete. The patients are responding, though not as I had hoped. The process is painful, but I believe it is necessary. If I succeed, we will change the world. If I fail, memory is not meant to be stolen. The mind will fight back. I fear I have gone too far. If anything happens to me, destroy my notes. Do not let anyone repeat my mistakes. The letter ended abruptly, the signature a single dash. But its meaning was clear. The doctor had been experimenting with memory, and he knew he was in danger. The machine. Survivors' stories, the nurse's diary, and the doctor's own notes all pointed to a mysterious machine, a device that hummed in the night, that made patients feel as if their minds were being pulled apart. No one knew exactly what it looked like, but the descriptions were eerily similar: wires, electrodes, a metal cap that fit over the patient's head. Some said the machine was based on early electroshock therapy, a crude attempt to reset the brain. Others believed it was more advanced, a prototype for the mind control devices that would appear in science fiction decades later. But whatever its purpose, the machine left scars on the bodies and minds of those who survived and on the hospital itself. The final night. The night the doors were sealed, the doctor worked alone in the treatment room. The nurses heard the hum of the machine, the muffled cries of the patients, the doctor's voice, calm, insistent, relentless. According to Evelyn's diary, the doctor moved from bed to bed, attaching electrodes, adjusting dials, whispering instructions. Some patients screamed, others fell silent. The air was thick with fear and the smell of burning metal. At some point, something went wrong. The machine began to spark, the lights flickered, and the screams grew louder. The doctor shouted for help, but no one came. The doors were locked, the staff paralyzed by fear. In the chaos, the doctor made a decision. He turned off the machine, gathered his notes, and disappeared into the night. Some say he escaped through a hidden passage, others that he was taken by the very forces he had tried to control. When the doors were finally opened, the ward was empty. The patients were gone, the doctor was gone, and the only thing left was the echo of the scream, the aftermath. In the days that followed, the hospital administration moved quickly to cover up the incident. The records were destroyed, the staff were silenced, and the ward was sealed. The official story was that a fire had damaged the East Wing, that the patients had been transferred to other hospitals, that the doctor had resigned for personal reasons. But the truth could not be hidden. The survivors remembered the machine, the pain, the fear. The families remembered the sudden silence, the unanswered questions. The staff remembered the doctor's eyes, the way he seemed to see right through them. And the scream remained, a wound that refused to heal, a question that refused to be answered. The doctor's legacy. As the years passed, the legend of the doctor's secret ward became a cautionary tale. New staff were warned never to ask about the East Wing, never to go near the sealed doors after dark. The hospital's reputation suffered, but the administration refused to reopen the investigation. But the story did not die. Every few years, someone would try to break into the sealed ward. Some found nothing but dust and darkness. Others claimed to see shadows moving in the corners or to hear voices calling their names. A few even claimed to see the doctor himself, older, thinner, his eyes still cold and unblinking. Some said he was searching for something he had lost, others that he was trapped in the ward, a prisoner of his own experiment, a new discovery. Decades after the incident, a group of medical students gained access to the old hospital as part of a research project. They were fascinated by the legend of Ward C and determined to find the truth. One night, they broke into the sealed ward, armed with flashlights and cameras. The air was thick with dust, the walls covered in peeling paint. The beds were gone, but the outlines remained, a ghostly reminder of the patients who had vanished. In the corner of the treatment room, they found a metal box, rusted and locked. Inside were the remains of the machine, wires, electrodes, a metal cap. There were also pages of notes written in the doctor's spidery handwriting. The notes described the experiment in detail. The process of transferring memories, the pain it caused, the failures, and the fleeting moments of success. The final entry was a warning. The mind is not a machine. It cannot be rewired without consequence. I have seen things I cannot explain, memories that do not belong, voices that are not my own. I fear I have opened a door that cannot be closed. The students turned the notes over to the authorities, who launched a new investigation. The hospital administration tried to suppress the story, but it was too late. The truth was out. The mind will fight back. The doctor's experiment was a failure, not because he lacked skill or intelligence, but because he underestimated the power of the human mind. Memories are not just data to be transferred or erased. They are the foundation of who we are, the source of our pain and our hope. In trying to heal his patients, the doctor had unleashed their deepest fears, their darkest memories. The machine did not erase trauma, it amplified it, turning whispers into screams, pain into madness. Some survivors lost their memories entirely, their minds wiped clean by the experiment. Others were left with fragments, visions of lives they had never lived, voices that were not their own. A few became obsessed with the doctor, convinced that he was still watching them, still trying to finish his work. The hospital itself became a repository of pain, a place where the past refused to die. The scream that echoed through the halls was not just the voice of the patients, it was the voice of the experiment itself, a warning to anyone who dared to repeat the doctor's mistakes. The doctor's disappearance. The fate of the doctor with no name remains one of the greatest mysteries of St. Augustine's. Some believe he changed his identity and continued his experiments elsewhere, moving from hospital to hospital, always searching for the answer he never found. Others believe he became a patient himself, lost in the maze of his own mind, haunted by the memories he had tried to erase. A few even claim he died in the hospital, his body hidden in the walls, his spirit trapped in the ward. But the most chilling theory is that the doctor never left, that he is still there, in the shadows of the East Wing, waiting for someone to open the door and finish what he started. A warning from the past. The story of the doctor's final experiment is a warning, a reminder that some secrets are too dangerous to uncover, that some doors should never be opened. The mind is a fragile thing, and the past cannot be erased without consequence. The scream that haunts St. Augustine's is not just a memory, it is a promise that the truth will always find a way to the surface, no matter how deeply it is buried. And so the legend of the doctor's secret ward lives on, a story of pain and hope, of genius and madness, of a scream that never stopped. The experiment ended, but the fear never left. How did the hospital's legacy of terror shape the city, and why do some say the doctor's shadow still lingers? The next chapter reveals how the legend grew and why the hospital's doors may never truly close. Subscribe to Sanctified Secrets and keep watching for more stories that refuse to be forgotten. The story of the doctor's secret ward was no longer just a tale whispered in the dark corners of St. Augustine's Hospital. It had become a living legend, a shadow that stretched across generations, shaping the lives of everyone who came near the East Wing. The hospital itself had changed. New wings were built, old corridors were renovated, and the city around it grew and modernized. But the fear remained as real and as raw as it had been on the night the doors were sealed. A hospital haunted by its past. For decades, the East Wing stood untouched, its doors locked and its windows boarded up. The hospital administration insisted it was for safety reasons, that the old structure was unstable and dangerous. But everyone knew the real reason. The East Wing was haunted, not by ghosts, but by memories, by secrets, by the echo of a scream that refused to die. New staff were warned on their first day, never ask about Ward C, never go near the locked doors after dark, never ever try to uncover the truth. The warnings were delivered with nervous laughter, but the fear in the eyes of the older nurses was unmistakable. Some tried to ignore the legend, focusing on their work and pretending not to hear the whispers in the walls. Others became obsessed, spending their breaks in the hospital archives, searching for clues, piecing together the fragments of a story that refused to be forgotten. But no one could escape the legacy of fear, the community's unease. The people who lived near St. Augustine's felt the weight of the hospital's past in their daily lives. Children dared each other to touch the locked doors, to spend a night in the shadow of the East Wing. Teenagers told stories of seeing faces in the windows, of hearing screams in the night, of feeling cold hands on their shoulders as they walked past the hospital gates. Local businesses struggled to survive, their customers put off by the hospital's reputation. Some families moved away, unable to bear the constant reminders of loss and pain. Others stayed, determined to fight for the truth, to demand justice for the patients who had vanished. The city council received countless complaints, but there was little they could do. The hospital was private property, and the administration refused to allow any further investigations. The police were called to disperse protests, but the crowds always returned, candles in hand, chanting the names of the missing. Attempts to break the seal. Every few years, someone would try to break into the sealed ward. Sometimes it was a group of teenagers fueled by bravado and curiosity. Other times it was a journalist, determined to uncover the truth. Once it was a former nurse, now old and frail, who claimed she had left something important behind. Most found nothing but dust and darkness. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay, the walls covered in peeling paint and graffiti. The beds were gone, but the outlines remained, a ghostly reminder of the patients who had vanished. But some claimed to see more. Shadows moving in the corners, faces pressed against the frosted glass, voices calling their names. A few even claimed to see the doctor himself, his eyes cold and unblinking, his white coat stained with blood. The stories spread quickly, fueling new rumors and new fears. The hospital administration responded by tightening security, installing new locks and cameras, hiring guards to patrol the East Wing. But the legend only grew stronger. The staff struggled. Inside the hospital, the staff struggled to cope with the legacy of fear. Some turned to alcohol or sleeping pills, desperate for a few hours of peace. Others left, unable to bear the weight of the past. A few became obsessed, spending their nights in the East Wing, listening for the scream, searching for answers. One nurse, Maria, kept a journal of her experiences. She wrote about the nightmares that haunted her, the whispers she heard in the empty hallways, the feeling that she was being watched. She wrote about the patients who refused to sleep, who woke up screaming, convinced that the doctor was standing at the foot of their beds. Maria's journal became a lifeline for other staff members, a place to share their fears and their pain. They compared notes, looking for patterns, for clues. Some believed the hospital was cursed, that the scream was a warning. Others thought it was a cry for help, a plea for justice. But all agreed on one thing. The fear was real, and it was not going away. The survivor's burden. For the survivors of Ward C, the legacy of fear was a daily reality. Many struggled with mental health issues, anxiety, depression, PTSD. Some turned to drugs or alcohol to numb the pain. Others withdrew from the world, unable to trust anyone, afraid that the doctor or something worse was still out there. A few found solace in each other, forming a small, tight-knit group. They met in secret, sharing their memories and their fears. They compared notes, trying to piece together what had happened in Ward C. They searched for answers, for closure, for justice. But the truth remained elusive. The hospital refused to release any information. The records were still missing, and the doctor had vanished without a trace. The survivors were left with only their memories, their scars, and the knowledge that they had survived something no one else could understand. The families fight. The families of the missing patients refused to give up. They organized protests, held vigils, and demanded answers from the hospital administration. They wrote letters to the city council, to the media, to anyone who would listen. Some found comfort in the community they built, in the shared pain and the shared hope. Others grew bitter, convinced that the truth would never be revealed. But all agreed that the hospital owed them answers, that the legacy of fear could not be allowed to continue. The media's obsession. The story of the doctor's secret ward became a sensation. Newspapers ran headlines like, "The hospital that hid its patients," and "The scream that never stopped." Television crews camped outside the hospital, hoping to capture the sound on camera. Podcasts and YouTube channels devoted entire episodes to the legend, analyzing the recordings, interviewing survivors and staff, speculating about the truth behind the scream. Some claimed it was the result of a government experiment gone wrong, others that it was the work of a mad scientist. A few even suggested that the hospital was built on cursed ground, that the scream was the voice of the land itself crying out for justice. But for those who had heard the scream, the theories didn't matter. The sound was real, and it was a wound that refused to heal. A new generation. As the years passed, a new generation of staff and patients came to St. Augustine's. Many had heard the stories, but few believed them. The hospital was modernized, new wings were built, and the old East Wing was left to decay. But the scream remained. Some nights, it was as loud as ever, echoing through the empty halls, rattling the windows, waking patients from their sleep. Other nights, it was barely a whisper, a faint reminder of the past. But it was always there, a wound that refused to heal, a secret that refused to die. The hospital's closure. Eventually, the weight of the past became too much. The hospital's reputation suffered, and patients began to seek care elsewhere. The administration tried to rebrand, to distance itself from the legend, but it was no use. In the end, St. Augustine's was forced to close its doors. The building was left to decay, its windows boarded up, and its halls silent. But the legend lived on, carried by the wind, by the memories of those who had suffered, by the scream that refused to die. The building still stands. The hospital itself became a symbol, a warning to those who would seek to hide the truth, a reminder that some secrets cannot be buried. The building still stands, its walls crumbling, its windows shattered. Locals avoid it, and those who dare to enter rarely stay gone. Some say the scream can still be heard on quiet nights, echoing through the empty halls. Others claim to see shadows moving in the corners, to feel cold hands on their shoulders, to hear voices calling their names. But all agree on one thing. The legacy of fear is real, and it is not going away. The legend lives on. The story of the doctor's secret ward is more than just a ghost story. It is a reminder of the power of fear, of the danger of secrets, of the importance of truth. It is a story that has shaped the lives of everyone who has come near the East Wing, a story that will continue to haunt the city for generations to come. And as long as the scream echoes through the halls of St. Augustine's, the legend will live on, a warning, a plea, a promise that the truth will always find a way to the surface. The hospital's gone, but the secret remains. What would you do if you found a locked door in a place like this? In our final chapter, we'll confront the question that haunts everyone who hears this story. Don't miss the conclusion. Subscribe to Sanctified Secrets and discover more mysteries that will leave you questioning everything. The story of the doctor's secret ward had become more than a legend. It was a living, breathing part of the city's history. Decades had passed since the night the doors were sealed, but the questions remained, echoing through the empty halls of St. Augustine's Hospital and the hearts of those who remembered. The hospital itself was now a relic, its windows boarded, its walls crumbling, but the secret at its core had never been revealed. A city haunted. The city had changed. New buildings rose where old ones fell, and the world outside moved on. But the shadow of the hospital lingered. Children still dared each other to run up to the locked doors, to press their ears against the cold wood, and listen for the scream. Teenagers snuck in at night, their flashlights flickering as they whispered about the doctor and the patients who had vanished. For the families of the missing, the pain never faded. Some had moved away, trying to escape the memories. Others stayed, tending to the graves of loved ones whose bodies were never found, lighting candles on the anniversary of the sealing, and gathering with other families to share stories and comfort. The survivors, too, carried the scars. Some found peace in sharing their stories, in knowing they were not alone. Others withdrew, haunted by nightmares, and the feeling that the doctor's eyes were still watching from the shadows. The final investigation. Years after the hospital closed, a new investigation was launched. The city council, pressured by the families and the public, agreed to open the sealed East Wing one last time. A team of forensic experts, historians, and journalists gathered at the hospital gates, watched by a crowd of onlookers and news cameras. The doors were heavy, the locks rusted. It took hours to break them open. When the team finally stepped inside, they found a world frozen in time. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. The beds were gone, but the outlines remained, etched into the floor like shadows. In the treatment room, they found the remains of the doctor's machine, wires, electrodes, a metal cap. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched into the paint by desperate hands. In one corner, a pile of old notebooks and papers, half burned, offered fragments of the doctor's notes. The team worked for days, cataloging every item, photographing every detail. They found no bodies, no evidence of what had happened to the missing patients. The records were incomplete, the clues frustratingly vague, but the sense of fear was palpable, as if the walls themselves remembered the pain and terror of that final night. The truth, or something like it. The investigation's findings were inconclusive. The official report spoke of unethical medical experiments, missing records, and unexplained phenomena. The city council issued a statement expressing sympathy for the families and promising to preserve the hospital as a historical site. But for those who had lived through the nightmare, the report was a disappointment. There were no answers, no closure, only more questions. The secret of the doctor's secret ward remained just out of reach, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Yet in the absence of certainty, the legend only grew stronger. The story was retold in books, documentaries, and podcasts. Artists painted murals of the hospital, their canvases filled with shadows and screams. Musicians wrote songs about the ward that screamed, their melodies haunting and sad. A place frozen in time. The hospital itself became a destination for the curious and the brave. Urban explorers snuck in at night, their cameras capturing images of empty corridors and peeling paint. Paranormal investigators set up equipment in the East Wing, hoping to record the scream or catch a glimpse of the doctor's ghost. Some claimed to see shadows moving in the corners, to hear voices calling their names, to feel cold hands on their shoulders. Others found nothing but silence and dust. But all agreed that the hospital was a place of power, a place where the past refused to die. The city eventually fenced off the building, posting signs warning trespassers to stay away. But the legend could not be contained. The story of the doctor's secret ward was now a part of the city's identity, a reminder of the dangers of secrets and the power of fear. The question that remained. For those who had lost loved ones, the question was simple. What happened to the patients of Ward C? Were they victims of a madman's experiment, or something even darker? Did they die in the hospital, their bodies hidden away? Or were they taken somewhere else, their memories erased and their lives stolen? For the survivors, the question was more personal. Why did I survive? Why do I remember things that never happened, dreams that are not my own? Was the doctor trying to help, or was he simply using us as test subjects in a quest for knowledge that should never have been pursued? For the staff who remained, the question was one of guilt. Could I have done more? Should I have spoken out, even if it meant losing my job, my reputation, my safety? Was I complicit in the cover-up, or simply a victim of fear? And for the city itself, the question was existential. What does it mean to live in the shadow of such secret? How do we move forward knowing that the truth may never be known? The power of memory. In the end, the story of the doctor's secret ward is a story about memory, about the things we remember, the things we forget, and the things we choose to hide. The doctor believed he could erase pain, transfer memories, give his patients a second chance. But in his quest for a miracle, he unleashed a nightmare. The survivors carried memories that were not their own, dreams that belonged to others. The families carried the memory of loss, the pain of not knowing. The staff carried the memory of fear, the guilt of silence. And the city carried the memory of a scream that never stopped. But memory is not just a burden. It is also a source of strength. The survivors found comfort in each other, in the knowledge that they were not alone. The families found hope in their fight for the truth, in the belief that justice would one day be done. The staff found courage in their willingness to speak out, to break the silence. And the city found meaning in the legend, in the power of a story that refused to die. Would you open the door? As the years passed, the question became a kind of test, a riddle whispered among those who knew the story. If you found a locked door in an abandoned hospital, would you open it? Would you risk unleashing the secrets hidden inside? Or would you walk away, leaving the past undisturbed? Some said they would open the door, driven by curiosity, by the need for answers. Others said they would walk away, knowing that some secrets are too dangerous to uncover. But the truth is, the door is always there, waiting. The secret remains just out of reach, a challenge to those who seek the truth. A final reflection. The doctor's secret ward is gone now, its doors rusted, its windows shattered. The hospital is silent, the scream faded to a memory. But the story lives on, carried by those who remember, by those who care, by those who refuse to let the past be forgotten. Maybe the truth will never be known. Maybe the secret will remain, locked away in the shadows of the East Wing. Or maybe, one day, someone will find the missing piece, the final clue, and the story will finally be complete. Until then, the legend endures, a warning, a mystery, a testament to the power of memory and the danger of secrets. And as you finish this story, ask yourself, what would you do if you found a locked door in an abandoned hospital? Would you open it, or would you walk away, leaving the secret undisturbed? The choice is yours. But remember, the past is never truly gone. The secret remains, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. The secret of the doctor's ward may never be fully revealed, but the echoes of the past still call out to those who listen. If you want to uncover more hidden histories and chilling mysteries, subscribe to Sanctified Secrets and explore our other videos.